So, good afternoon. And last session for that part of the world that has half of its population. Asia includes the largest systems of higher education in the world, indeed. We're focusing a little bit more on China and Japan, but to set the framework, I think we are going to look in particular at this. It has already been mentioned a couple of times, and if you put it in Google and you do images, you get this. So the One Belt, One Road. And you get slightly different images, and this is exactly, I think, how it presents itself. Nobody knows exactly where it goes, but it can be a very important global strategy that China is rolling out here, depending very much on who will buy into it. McKinsey doing a very large consultancy wrote a very strong report asking the question, China's One Belt, One Road, will it reshape global trade? In the same fashion, we can ask ourselves the question, China's One Belt, One Road, will it reshape global higher education? Or is it a road towards higher education with Chinese characteristics? That with Chinese characteristics is, of course, a term, a concept that we hear time and again in every speech of the Chinese president and members of his party. Socialism with Chinese characteristics, all sorts of things. What exactly higher education with Chinese characteristics will be, and what it means for the world, the global higher education scene, that I think is very, very important to ask as a question. So that's what we're doing. I'll say a few words about a project that has been mentioned and that I'm developing together with, among others, William Kirby. What will be the implications of the New Silk Road? It's a little bit more specific than One Belt, One Road, which is even more global. The New Silk Road referring to the Old Silk Road, more precisely spanning the Eurasian continent. So we'll focus on what it will mean for cooperation in research and higher education between China and Europe. Building on prior research that I undertook in 2015, trying to look at globalization from a Chinese point of view, as a framework to analyze and understand what China is doing in higher education and research, rather than describing it from a Western perspective. And our conclusion was then that it is time to view China not just as a follower, but also look at its potential role as a global leader in higher education. And leaving out the last three words, that sentence reads, I think, now more in general. What we have seen since is a very rapidly changing global context. Don't need to say anything about the upper parts being discussed at length, I think, here. But at the same time, China is launching new global initiatives which could potentially span and integrate major parts of the world, but likely on new and different conditions, also for higher education. And with the recent geopolitical developments in the West, I think for China, that process is accelerating. And that's what we hear. I think you remember the opening of the World Economic Forum earlier this year by President Xi Jinping, who said, we're ready to lead the world. We're ready to lead on economic globalization. We're ready to lead the Paris Accord on climate change. And also, again, back to higher education, I attended the 7th conference of WorldClass universities in Shanghai earlier this month, and the conference theme was Towards a Global Common Good. That's an a topic, a theme that was put on the agenda by the Chinese organizers. So this is a map produced by the same Shanghai ranking club with the top 500 universities in the world, and you can very well see how that explains the flows of students and young researchers, primarily, and we have seen the largest flow going from Asia to US, the second largest to the EU. Of course, the flows within the EU, since the crisis, more from the south to the north. Traditional flows, mostly from the south to the north, not exclusively. And what we now see is flows towards the east. That is not only returnees, although the percentage of Chinese students that studied abroad and that returned to China increased in a decade from 30% to 82%. It's also China's policy to attract international students to the country. And increasingly, as I said, with the uncertainties here, China sees the way to make itself more visible and develop a global role and redraft this part of the world map. So, a reason to continue our research, we think, by focusing more in particular on China's rise in global higher education and research and development on that part of the Silk Road, and try to understand how these new relationships will affect European higher education and research. And what are China's values and how will they impact? And do we understand them at all? And what will be the impact of these developments on the global higher education landscape, on the dominant role of the US in it, and I think most importantly, how do we prepare our students for safe travels on these new Silk Roads towards a new history of the world, as Peter Frankopan put it. Relevance, like the old Silk Road, the new Silk Road will carry more than consumer goods alone. China's rise is among the most important geopolitical trends, and like all previous geopolitical trends, that will affect international cooperation in higher education. The size of China's system and the speed at which it develops both education and research to global standards, and we need to further our understanding of globalization. Try to find and develop a combined West-East perspective to understand what is actually going on. There's a lot going on. On the right-hand side, some of the activities, alliances, research cooperation, projects, bilateral, multilateral agreements being signed almost by the day. There are mutual interests. The EU is China's largest trade partner, has a lot of interest in foreign investment, was among the first to join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, unlike the US. There's mutual interest in skills and technology transfer, but there's also a lot of challenges. EU's foreign policy, if any, immigration, security, open access, internet openness, those are big, big, big challenges and questions in cooperation with China. China's rise, as I said, it's the fastest and largest system and fastest development system in the world. Strong international growth. China's share of the world GDP, number 3. The share of that spent on research and development, second in position. And the OECD expects that China will have the largest R&D budget before the end of this decade. Large share of researchers, and all of that mostly in STEM, more precisely in engineering. So this is another map of these world-class universities, and then you see that basically this is the competition that is going on in engineering across China, mostly these 39, and the US. And the double WorldClass project that China announced in September will build on the previous excellence initiatives in China and will, for almost 50% of all the investments and efforts, focus on exactly these fields. And this is the result. If you look at the fields in which China holds a #1 position worldwide, and more than 20% of the top 50 places in the world, you get to these 4 very, very specific fields in engineering, and the other 7 if you look at one of these 2 indicators. These are important fields for China's economic development, its innovation, but also for China's geostrategic positioning. Confirmed by data from another ranking, of course, and not Chinese ranking, the Leiden ranking. And if you look at the middle 2 columns and you look at the absolute numbers, you can see where they are in these fields. All right, so global impact. Whether the 21st century can be the Chinese century in higher education is a question that wouldn't even have been asked a decade ago. And it's a comparative question. Who leads whom? And for how long will the US still be leading? That's the interest in research by my colleague, Bill Kirby. For us in Europe, I think we're very hesitant, very hesitant. There were few government leaders at the summit that President Xi hosted in September, October on the One Belt, One Road. Most leaders sent ministers. I think that while China hopes to lead on a better form of globalization as it presents it, on a more sustainable, inclusive version that would lead to further rebalancing global inequality. This is literal quotes from Xi Jinping's presentations. I think Western countries are still digesting the political backlash from the growing inequalities spawned by globalization within their borders. So, questions are, how will China contribute to higher education as a global good and to an open society which is based on the belief in fundamental human rights, dignity, the rule of law? How will China's soft power work out along the new Silk Road? So this is the research we want to undertake, mapping of flows, look at what higher education institutions do in terms of strategies and activities, and then dig deeper. Under which conditions are these activities happening and who sets these conditions? If the analogy is the entrance of China in the World Trade Organization, then we will have very uneven results. Based on which values? Digging even deeper. Regarding the model of the university, the idea of the university, issues around, as key questions in this conference, academic freedom, institutional autonomy, and scientific integrity. I'm gonna wrap up. This will be difficult because we need to combine perspectives. We cannot, as I said earlier, just look at China as a follower from a Western perspective. We will have to come up with more comprehensive, more combined perspectives. That's going to be a challenge. It will be insufficient to do this in a comparative perspective. And I'm working with my colleague Simon Marginson to see how we can make progress, because we believe that he agrees with me, if collaboration is to be taken forward among scholars, the time of separated, mononational, monocultural views has passed. We have to come up with better methodologies and better conceptual frameworks. Maybe, this is very, very early, by looking at broader concepts that work for both sides. Global goals, like we have them in Horizon 2020, and this is again quotes from recent Chinese policy documents. There is a lot of overlap, but do we really mean the same things, and how will it be operated? build the processes and mechanisms of integration as we have learned about in European cooperation, meaning combined cooperation and competition. Will that be useful to look at from a multi-actor perspective? See how integration frameworks, integration processes in different regions now work across regions, with outcomes like Christine also said this morning, convergence and divergence, all of that to be developed. This is the partnership, and there will be a few more partners that will try to work on that in the coming period. Thank you. CSHE. So, the first, yes, I need to have a program. There you go.